On today's More Than a Test, we invite Dr. Molly Ness to the table. If you have heard the name Molly Ness, you've probably read one of her many books about education and teaching and literacy. You probably even have her new book about Read-Alouds and the importance of Read-Alouds kindergarten through 8th grade. But today she's going to tell us about how she's a teacher's teacher and how she makes sure everything she does is accessible to teachers and is meaningful to students and can be changed and implemented in the classroom. So welcome with me, Molly Ness. Molly, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's actually really great timing because last week I hosted Peter Brown, who is the author of many fabulous children's books that are used as read-alouds across the country. And you have a new book out about read-alouds. So I felt like this really connected well. Tell us a little bit about your book.
Yes, it's a solution tree book called Read-Alouds for All Learners. And the idea behind it is that as these conversations about the science of reading have come into everyday conversations, so major media outlets, social media, documentaries, podcasts, etc., there's been so much focus on the constrained skills of word recognition. So if you look at the Scarborough Reading Rope, there's been so many conversations about decoding and word identification. But we can't overlook the importance of those unconstrained skills of language comprehension. And so I wrote this to really draw awareness to the fact that every teacher, pre-K through 8, and I did not write about high school, not because there's no place for read-alouds in high school, but just because that's not where my teaching experience falls. But knowing that all teachers, pre-K through 8, regardless of what content area, they have the ability to facilitate and enhance and build and promote kids' language comprehension through read-alouds, through building vocabulary, through background knowledge. And that is equally as important in these conversations about the science of reading.
I'm so glad you said this. This is one of my first questions, as I was going to say, not really the in vogue topic right now to be talking about read-alouds, because all we seem to be talking about is phonics and teaching those skills. And so I'm curious, tell us a little bit more about why this message matters so much and what are read-alouds doing that is so important, even though it seems like all we're talking about is phonics right now.
Sure. And it sort of keeps me up at night as well, as because when we look at sort of the measures of what we are using to analyze student success, we're looking at things like NAEP. And NAEP, these tests at 4th and 8th grade and 12th grade, are not just phonics. They're not just word identification. Sure, you have to have the ability to lift the words off the page to read the passages. But if you look at the passages, they're really passages of background knowledge and vocabulary and language comprehension. So I wrote this to show that not only are those skills and components essential, but we all have the capability of building language comprehension as we do something as sort of tried but true and familiar as read-alouds. I also wrote it to show that the research is actually pretty compelling. When we talk about read-alouds, we're all pretty familiar with the data and the research that shows kids' linguistic benefits, how kids' language improves, how their vocabulary, their syntax, their writing, all these things improve. But there's some pretty compelling new research that shows that read-alouds actually improve kids' physiological states. And the big takeaway for me as I was planning this book is research showing that 50 to 70% of teachers don't intentionally plan their read-alouds. And I was that teacher. When I was a middle school teacher, I read aloud every day to my kids. And my planning was how many pages I'd probably have the chance to cover in that allotted time. And I didn't go much deeper than that. And what we know is when we don't intentionally plan read-alouds, we miss instructional opportunities. Our language is more surface level and more shallow. And the way that kids interact with the text isn't as rich and as deep as it could be were we to be more intentional in our planning.
I'm going to be honest. You don't need to convert me, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to tell you a story of a little girl I was watching read with Amira recently. She was reading a story about Thomas Edison, second grader, fluent reader, beautiful, just like absolutely perfect. And then Amira popped up with a question. The word genius had been in the story 3 times, and Amira asked her, "What does the word genius mean?" And the little girl picked a light bulb. That was the answer she picked. She had this word she could perfectly read. She didn't know what it meant, right? And so I'm already convinced. But tell me, in short, because I know your book has a lot of nuance and information to it. But like when you say an intentionally planned read aloud is going to make, it can make a big difference. What does that look like? And what are those things that need to be intentionally planned?
Sure. So the first thing that I do in intentionally planning is pre-reading, I evaluate the text. So what I do is I go through the text and look for those instructional opportunities, as well as background knowledge and funds of knowledge that kids need to understand. If they don't have it, or if I don't intentionally do something to build it, it potentially is a comprehension impediment. And so when I am able to sort of identify those potential comprehension stopping points, then I'm able to do a little pre-teaching to make sure that they've got the background knowledge or the funds of knowledge to make that read aloud more meaningful. During the read aloud, I intentionally plan my think alouds, where you just spoke so nicely about a comprehension check for a kid. Another thing that I like to do is metacognitive first person narrative modeling of the thinking that I'm doing, so that it's almost like I'm cracking open my head and modeling the internal thought processes that I, as a proficient teacher, proficient reader, am using. So I help kids show how to make meaning. And then my last thing of planning is really extending literacy opportunities beyond the text. So what am I going to do to make meaning of the text, to build kids reading, writing, speaking, and listening, as well as how can I support kids' cross-curricular understanding of the text, and then build their socio-emotional learning opportunities throughout the text.
That's awesome. I love the modeling of the thinking. I think as someone who, I have 3-year-old twins, I was a teacher. I taught kindergarten, I taught third grade, I taught all over. And it wasn't until I had my own children that I realized how much you have to explicitly teach people just even how to think, right? So I think that's really valuable. When I was a principal, I used to show this clip of this guy who won Jeopardy like a bajillion times. And they asked him like what was the key to his success, and he said, I go to the library and read children's books. There's so much information in these books in such a digestible, easy to get way. Like, this is how I've gotten it. And that was kind of like my pitch on picture books, because I really love read-alouds. But I'm curious, like, you have the research, right? More than just a Jeopardy winner. Like, what is your pitch to educators about read-alouds matter, planning them matter? Like, what are you seeing in the information, in the research that you've done?
Well, so we know there's a little bit of a mismatch between the rich availability of texts and their ability to take really complicated topics and put them in kid-friendly language. I was actually just reading a kids' picture book about radium. I mean, it's not something I understand, isotopes and all those sorts of things, but just the way it was written was like, okay, this is would have been a great use for me if I were going on to Jeopardy. But unfortunately, what we know is that most teachers, and again, I'm not sort of like teacher blaming, teacher shaming, because I was one of these teachers, their text choices tend to be typically about 25 years old. Teachers tend to read from familiar texts that sort of evoke those warm, fuzzy feelings that we had. We think back to our fourth grade teacher reading to us. And so we don't always capitalize on the new on new texts that offer a whole lot of diversity, offer a whole lot of topic and genre choice. So I think one of the things I hope that people take away from the book is that we also have to sort of push past what is considered the traditional read aloud. So when you say read aloud, lots of us go back to they in their mind picture, a kindergarten teacher on a rocking chair, kids all snuggled around him or her on the floor. I really find lots of engaging opportunities for a middle school physical education teacher to read aloud, or a 8th grade biology teacher, or a 6th grade social studies teacher to read aloud in sort of instructional bursts. Maybe they're not, the whole text front cover to back cover. Maybe they're not, a full 15 minutes, but maybe you read aloud. If you're a gym teacher, you read aloud and you're starting a unit on volleyball. Maybe you read aloud from the International Volleyball Association, the rules. And if you're a 7th grade teacher, maybe you read from a speech or a eulogy of a particular leader that you read. If you're a biology teacher, or maybe you read aloud about global warming that's in headline news in newspapers all the time. So there's ways to do it in in way that pushed beyond what we sort of in our minds have as the traditional read aloud.
I really love it, and you really are pushing my mind on a traditional read aloud, which is really great. I remember having a social studies teacher read like first person letters and things like that, and what a difference it makes to like learn to listen to how someone reads that, and it's super valuable. I really appreciate that you brought up the diversity. When I was working in a school, we did an audit. There was an audit that came out about picture books again, and their diversity, and it was like a list of how many, what kind of, if you went through every picture book in the world or in the country at least, like which characters were the most prevalent. And the first was little white boys. And the second was animals. It wasn't even little girls. It was the second most prevalent character to find in a picture book was animals. So I really appreciate that you're bringing up this new idea of diversity. Do you have any favorite new picture books or books that you would use to read aloud?
So I am always fond of books that tell sort of the untold story, or the person, sort of the underdog, or the person who sort of broke barriers in whatever their particular field was. One of my favorite books to read aloud is a picture book called The William Hoy Story. And it is about a deaf baseball player. I'm blanking on when he played, but he was a deaf baseball player. And the reason that if you watch baseball live or if you watch it on TV, you'll see hand signals between the pitcher and the catcher, between the ump, between the batter and the coach. All of those are because of this deaf baseball player who needed a way to communicate. And I love that, like, most kids are familiar with, they've seen it on TV or they've seen it in real life. And you say, do you know how those came to be? Well, they actually came because of this deaf baseball player named William Hoy. And so the book talks about the creation of these signals. And I love that it showcases sort of an untold story of a character who is deaf and made a significant contribution to something that we see every day in sports.
I have never heard this story and I love it. And I don't know about you, but I always feel like I can picture those kids that were in my class who love to be the expert on something. So like my baseball expert would have loved that book and being the person who knew that. Your book is pre-K through 8, which I think you kind of mentioned this is somewhat surprising, that like even in middle school you recommend read-alouds. I will say my experience in schools right now is teachers are overworked. It feels like they don't have enough time for anything, whether it's teaching or planning. And so I'm curious, in that, how much time do you think should be dedicated to one, doing reading aloud to children, and two, planning for your read aloud?
Sure. So, as a former classroom teacher and as somebody who is constantly in schools and classrooms, I get it. I know how full that plate is. What I try to remind myself as I'm struggling to make time for something is that we find the time for the things that we prioritize. So if we prioritize building kids' background knowledge and language comprehension and vocabulary and all these hugely important components, then what better way to do it than through a read aloud? I also am reminded that most teachers enjoy the read aloud. It's one of their favorite parts of the day, and they wish they had more time for it. And we also know that when surveyed, kids in particular have really fond memories of reading aloud, or I should say, of being read to. We also know that there's this tendency called the decline at 9, which shows that right around when kids turn 9, somewhere late 3rd grade, early 4th grade, we see a decline in the frequency of read-alouds, both at school and at home. And the reasons why, well, adults think kids don't need to be read to. It's too babyish. They can read on their own. And what's even cooler about this research is that kids say, no, I wish my parent kept reading to me. I wish my grown-up, my adult, my teacher kept reading to me. So when I say that teachers love it, I'm also reminded that kids love it. And so I typically aim for somewhere about 10 to 15 minutes of a read aloud. And that does not have to be in one fell swoop. That can be your social studies teacher reading aloud a letter or a journal. That can be, then you take a really difficult part of the textbook and you read aloud before you set kids off into independent reading. So it doesn't have to be, all in one uninterrupted chunk. And I typically, when I plan for my read alouds, to me, the things that I really have to identify, I have to identify that background knowledge. If my kids don't understand what is going on before reading the text, then they don't have that mental Velcro to take new learning and to apply it to. And so that's going to be a huge instructional bang for my buck, is just some of that front loading. So I typically spend about 5 minutes or so really identifying the background knowledge. And if you're choosing a longer text, like a chapter book, chances are the background knowledge or the funds of knowledge remains the same throughout the text. So yes, I'm totally aware that it takes time, but our students deserve to have that read aloud be as instructionally rich as possible and enjoyable for them and their teacher.
I don't know where the words knowledge Velcro came from, but I love it. And I'm going to use it like all day long. I think
Well,
that's incredible. This idea of like, go ahead.
yeah, it's actually, I would love to take the credit for it, but it's Natalie Wexler, who many of us know as the author of The Knowledge Gap. And she writes how background knowledge is such an important component of reading instruction. She actually wrote the foreword for this book.
Oh, great. I love it. You can just picture, right? Like you give the kids the right information at the front load, then they can stick to it. It's incredible. Thank you for that. And thank you, Natalie Wexler. Let me ask you something. Do you have a feeling about rereads of read-alouds? Like there's a lot of perspectives around like, should teachers be rereading books? If they need background knowledge, they need as much exposure as possible. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so if it's a shorter text, I'm all for the read aloud. We know that the more read aloud, rereading that you do, the more kids retain vocabulary, the more you can dive into richer comprehension support. As a parent, I was very impatient with the read me this book for the 17th time. And I had to sort of remind myself that, no, this is an opportunity where I can draw my child in more as a learner and not just it be sort of a didactic read aloud. Obviously, for those longer books, I'm going to be really purposeful and just reread particular sections of the text that are really juicy or need a lot of unpacking or what have you. I'm impatient about rereading because there's so many great books and so little time.
I feel the same way. However, I have read a few books in my house at least 3,000 times, and it is fun to read it with my kids. So I get that. Something you said earlier, you said you're in classrooms a lot. And what I notice when I look at like the full library of books that you've written, because this is not your first book, is that they seem very intentionally applicable for teachers. This is not like pie in the sky research. This is like read this and you can improve your practice and help your kids more tomorrow. Why is that your calling? And tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I consider myself a teacher of teachers. The perspective that I always take is really two sorts of perspectives. First, I started my career in education with Teach for America way back many moons ago. I was in Oakland, California, and had a very rapid fire 5-week training and didn't want a whole lot of theory and didn't want a whole lot of, convoluted ideology. I wanted tell me what to do tomorrow. And then I spent either 16 or 17 years. I can never remember. And that's how old I'm getting. I spent many, many semesters as a university professor in a traditional graduate program, preparing teachers and working with early career and pre-service teachers, and was very, very well aware that they were actually, many of them were Teach for America core members themselves. So it was this sort of nice kind of, my work had come full cycle, but I was always aware that they wanted help me figure out tomorrow. It's Tuesday afternoon. It's the, right before the holiday break mayhem. What am I going to do to capture my kids' attention? So I've always seen my work as translating the kind of ivory tower or think tank or research lab research to those who need it, who are the teachers in classrooms. And so I've worked really hard to make my writing and my work in classrooms be practitioner friendly and honor teachers' knowledge and realities, as well as sort of supporting it with the research behind our instructional decisions.
I really appreciate that. And I think most teachers do as well. You're exactly right. It's like, what can I do tomorrow? And I think that's incredible. I want to ask you one more question about this concept of comprehension and knowledge and background knowledge and all this information. Because you and I met at the Reading Week. and at their conference. And if you had asked me to come up with like one theme of this year's Reading League conference in October, I would have said comprehension is our next problem, right? Like we're closing the gap on fluency, we're closing it on phonics, but there is a background knowledge chasm coming our way, right? Would you agree with that? And do you think that that's right? That's what's coming next?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with it, and am mindful that comprehension is so complicated. There's a reason why Scott Paris in 2005 wrote about constrained skills and unconstrained skills. Constrained skills being those word identification. You sort of have an agenda. There's a clear path. You know when your kids have mastered their letter sounds versus the complications of unconstrained. I can learn a new vocabulary word every day and not reach the end of the dictionary. I can learn background knowledge until I'm blue in the face and never reach the end of, Google or what have you. So it's a lot more complicated and nuanced. And I'm not convinced as well that we've really figured out the best measures for comprehension. So that's another thing that we have to unpack. But absolutely, I think it's the next frontier. And I hope that we have the patience and the stamina to really stick with it, because this is one of those things where with regard to word identification and fluency, we can see relatively quick gains, but comprehension is going to be more of a marathon. So I hope we have the resilience and the patience to sort of stick with it and stay the course.
It's interesting you say that. I feel like stamina is exactly the right word, and it's the word that keeps coming up, or like the concept that keeps coming up for other people, saying, like, now that we have the science of reading research and we're getting it into the hands of teachers, it is so crucial that we stay the course, do the work. We know this is going to work, but we got to stick with it. And it's really hard for teachers who have kind of been swung all over the place depending on the year. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I love talking about Read-Alouds with you. It's really fun and it's super validating as someone who loves Read-Alouds. But I would love to talk a little bit about you, because you said multiple times now you were a teacher first, and that you're a teacher of teachers now. What did you teach?
I taught sixth grade social studies, and it was called English Language Development in Oakland, California, as my start. ELD at the time in California was levels 1 through 5, 5 being right before kids were mainstreamed into English only classrooms. And my kids, my first couple of years were levels 1 and 2. And there were probably about 14 languages in the classroom: Cambodian, Cantonese, Spanish, Arabic. So I was really, I was pretty overwhelmed. And I'm so grateful for that experience, because I did it thinking I was going to law school. And this was sort of a resume builder or a stopping point. And quickly realized that literacy, that really education and literacy in particular were the social justice issue that mattered most to me. And so all of my work since that time and teaching since then has really been about literacy, equity, and access.
That's incredible. I love that you were honest enough to say that, like, you went into Teach for America to thinking you wanted to be a lawyer. I think that's a lot of people. That's the path that they were planning on. So it's cool that you ended up where you have. How did you? So you taught, and then at what point did you decide, like, first of all, that this is your area that you want to work on, and two, that more school was next, and getting a PhD was important to you.
So after my original Teach for America placement, I taught in LA for a little bit, and I guess I was mid to late-ish 20s and kind of had a little bit of an identity crisis. Knew I loved reading, knew I loved writing, and actually applied for grad school in a bunch of different things. I applied for programs in education. I applied for programs in journalism. I applied for programs in creative writing, and ultimately just knew education was the thing for me. So came back east. I'm from the East Coast originally. I spent 4 years at the University of Virginia, and my program was in reading education, and I at the time was funded by Reading First. So this was under No Child Left Behind. Reading First was, UVA was the center for Reading First for the state of Virginia. And so I was a research assistant. And so what we called back then scientifically based reading research, now we're calling the science of reading. So, however many years ago, I guess I'm coming up on 20 years or so, having been done from grad school. But these were the conversations. I read The Simple View from 1986 as a grad student in 2002. So to me, as exciting as this particular time on the literacy landscape is, with so many people talking about reading, there's also a little part of me that's like, what took the rest of you so long? Like, I've been thinking about this and talking about this for nearly, going on 3 decades here. So again, I think about that patience and that stamina and that motivation to be in it for the long haul.
Well, I hear you about the taking you so long, but I also would say if there's ever been like a sign that you were in the right place, that might be it. Because I know quite a few people who went to go get masters and PhDs at the same time in literacy education and ended up with a balanced literacy
True.
education.
True.
Right? Like that's what you got.
Yeah. And it was,
and so I'm just curious how.
it was actually really eye-opening. I remember leaving UVA, and I was very grateful to have professors that, like, I was reading Stanovich and, all the names back then. And then I came to New York to become a professor, and kind of having this, did I step back in time sort of feeling of, I was seeing what was going on in schools and sort of being like, this is not, doesn't align or doesn't mesh with the way I was trained. And so it took a long time for me to sort of reconcile my training with the climate. And so it's been really interesting to be involved in the New York City literacy conversations for so many years and see these changes.
It's interesting because it feels like what you're saying about, did I go back in time? If you went to some university campuses right now, you'd have the same experience, right? Like, this idea that the wave has taken us all over on the beach and we're all swimming in the water of science of reading now is just not true. And so I'm curious, like, what would you say to some of these universities that are kind of taking their time to make the move, or to teachers who are trying to figure out what to do next, or who are still, like, there are districts who still have 6 years of contracts left with their balanced literacy curriculum. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think we have hard decisions to make. And do we let the kids in the pipeline, let the teachers in the pipeline suffer, get poorly trained, not get access to best practices because of contracts, or because we are sort of comfortable in teaching our courses the way that we've always taught them? Big changes are scary, but our kids need us to do more, and we all pay the price for what happens with regard to ineffective reading instruction. All of us. It not only does it hurt our society, but we pay the price in terms of, reliance on assistance and public health and our global economy. And there's just so many reasons why we have to really have meaningful conversations about, do the practices that we are incorporating in our teacher preparation, as well as our many times districts, are they aligned with science? And this is where we have to sort of be brave and accept the great challenge and the great privilege that we have been given as teachers and as educators, and do what's right for children. And it's going to take some of us having some kind of reconciling with, wow, I wish I had done differently. And that is, I'm also really grateful for the people who are leading these thought leaders, and the people who are kind of forging the path ahead are reminding us of the words of Maya Angelou, who says, when you know better, you do better. Because I think we all look at some of the things that we used to do as teachers and say, man, I was well-intentioned, but I didn't know. I certainly have some of those things when I think back to my first year of teaching. So I'm grateful that the climate is one that is accepting of wherever people are on their learning curves. And I would say to people, hurry up and join us. We're all waiting for you, and we're ready with open arms.
Oh, you sound like Kareem Weaver. That sounds like him, ready with open arms. Okay, let me ask you this. We have a lot of listeners who are educators. If you were talking to them and they were looking at a master's program or a program in literacy education, and they wanted to know if it was science of reading aligned, because a lot of things say science of reading on them, what would you tell them to look for?
So I look for the course texts that they're using. I look for the professors who are teaching the courses and what their particular contributions to the science are, because I want people who are not just turnkeying information, but also producing information in the science of reading. So I want to make sure that people are paying their hard-earned tuition dollars towards people who are thought leaders in science and research. I also look for what professional associations they're affiliated with. Are they, doing work with the Reading League? Are they attending professional conferences? Those sorts of things. So I do think there is some really important transparency that once you start digging, you can find out a lot more. And we're also at a point where, regardless of where people live, convenience should not just be the deciding factor in where people pursue their coursework, because there are so many options. There are so many open access things that if you can't afford a particular course, you can still learn information. And we're just at a really exciting time where the learning is readily accessible at people's after school hours or summer vacations or what have you. So there's so much out there. It can actually be a little bit overwhelming which way to look.
Yeah, I think we hear that a lot. Let me ask you this. I heard you kind of mention, like that you've kind of been with New York for a long time, seeing their different transitions. And I heard you mention that it feels like we've changed, right? Like we've turned a corner finally. What did that look like for you? How did you know we'd turned the corner?
So I think for me, one of the biggest corner changing events was when I was invited to the New York City Mayor's Literacy Advisory Council. For the last 2 years, there has been a council of thought leaders, experts, interested parties, stakeholders coming together to help redirect the city, which has a long history of balanced literacy, and say, move us in a direction, point the needle somewhere else quickly. And the process was, there were some frustrations. It was a little bit challenging at times, but the clarity on what the outcomes were meant to be and the full steam ahead sort of urgency of it was really, to me, important, because this was not going to be one of those, you're going to sit on this committee for 5 to 8 years and nothing's going to change. And, yes, there have been problems in rollout, but I do applaud the efforts for saying, you know what, our kids right now, we don't have any time to waste. So that to me was a really a powerful reminder of, wow, things are really, really starting to change here.
And when was that?
Was, I guess, let's see, fall of 2022. So I was probably asked spring of 2022, and the work still goes on. I will say that I live outside of the city, and New York City, and I actually think upstate New York are sort of making more progress in the science of reading than my home community and my where the areas where I live. So it's been really interesting to watch these huge districts change direction, kind of with more speed than some of the smaller ones. And I don't know why that has been that way. It's another interesting thing to think through.
Yeah, I think it's interesting being, where I am, where I get to see lots of different districts all of the time doing in different places and the implementation and the things they come up against is very different. And I think that we forget how unique school districts can be. It's so interesting because I think New York, in my opinion, has got to be one of the hardest places to make big swifting changes. One, because Columbia Teachers College is there, right? And they led the balanced literacy movement, and there was such a stronghold on the city there. And then two, it's a big when I go to schools in New York and I go visit them, every school is like its own island, right? So it is somewhat inspiring to hear the changes they're making and how hard, in a place that I think would be hard to change.
And we're also one of the only states that really, one of the few states that has no state legislation. You look at where we are at the national level, and New York is behind. And I feel very frustrated by that. And I am very grateful for the people who are advocating for state reform and legislative work.
Yeah, we've seen some big things out of like Ohio and some other places this year. So I think that's great that you mentioned that. It's interesting. That I noticed something that you said. You said, at one point you were looking at what people were doing, and it felt like you were going back in time, right? Like it was like, hey, we've been doing this for 30 years. And then at the same time, you have all this hope around New York City. And when you told me 2022, that feels like yesterday. I was like, oh my gosh, that was so late to the party. So when you think about the fact that, like, in many ways, a lot of your work is where people are late to the party, what gives you hope? What inspires you? What really excites you about where we are right now and where we're going?
So, what gives me hope and what inspires me is how many people are coming to the table for this conversation. It's not just teachers, it's not just those vocal boat rockers. And I say that me being a vocal boat rocker, it is people from all different fields. It is people in the medical field. It's our, people who study public health. It's so many people coming to the field to say literacy matters so much on not only the outcome of an individual child, but our communities and our larger society. So I am super excited by how sort of interdisciplinary the conversations that were really once siloed to those who lived in public education. So that gives me great hope. And I am super excited that I found my reading geeks that are just as dorky as I am about this science and want to talk about the brain and look at conference proceedings and are like, oh my gosh, there's so many places I want to be at the same time because I want to just soak it all in. So I'm really grateful that I have found my community of reading researchers and thought leaders and people who I think are making just such important contributions to helping kids be confident, habitual, lifelong readers.
I'm so grateful that, like, you've kind of shown exactly who you are, which is so lovely. Like, this person who loves research, loves the data, loves the stuff around the brain science, but cares the most about it getting to teachers. Like, that's what I see in your work and what I see in this conversation. I can't tell you how much it means to me and probably every other educator. We are getting close to the end of time. That was a really lovely way to go. So we're gonna go ahead and move to our 5 questions we ask everybody.
I
Are you
am.
ready? Okay. So the first question is, everyone hears the title More Than a Test and thinks it means something different. And so I'm curious, when you heard that our podcast is called More Than a Test, what did you think about?
I thought about how much of what we do with regard to reading is based on standardized tests. And so I thought about it being a more holistic approach to that, just the standardized testing approach.
Yeah, the one question that you said today that I'm going to like sit with for a while is, are we measuring comprehension correctly and background knowledge correctly? And I don't think anyone has an answer right now, but I think it's a great question. So it makes sense that that's where you thought of. Okay, so tell us about a lit moment in your life. And what we mean by a lit moment is a moment of you in a book that is either like your happy place or it changed you or just really important. So a time that you were with a book that was really important to you.
So a book that was one of those moments was the early grade reader, Are You My Mother? And I will never forget this moment. I was teaching. I was still a university professor. My daughter was a kindergartner. She was a kindergartner in a balanced literacy school and had a teacher who closed the door and gave her foundations and gave her explicit phonics and all these other things. And I remember teaching a course, coming home that night, and my daughter reading to me, Are You My Mother? And it was the first realization. This was January of her kindergarten year. And so it was the first realization of, I have a reader at home and the power of explicit instruction. That teacher was kind of a rebel and gave kids what she knew they needed. And she's still a teacher in my district. We're still friends. And I am forever grateful for her creation in my home of a reader.
Thank God for all the rebel teachers out there, right? All right, a piece of technology you love.
A piece of technology that I love is a good old school planner. I have adopted the Google Calendar. That was my 2023 resolution to get on the digital calendar. But I'm still the crazy person who every night before I go to bed or first thing in the morning with my cup of coffee takes my calendar and then writes it into an old school planner to remind me of what my day is going to look like. So give me an old fashioned planner and I'm in a happy place.
What planner do you use? I feel like this is such a teacher answer. Teachers
I
love their
know.
planners.
And there was a really funny meme about like somebody who, this is the year that I found the planner that is going to totally organize my life. I don't have one that I am has to be the one. I right now like ones by Ink and Volt. They're kind of minimalist and very bare, but I need a day by day thing because I need a place for, all right, what are my errands that I have to do for like my house and my kid, and what's my work stuff, and what's like, am I gonna eat today, am I gonna exercise? So I need like multiple places to record all that stuff.
I love it. All right. Best advice you've ever been given?
Oh man, best advice I've ever been given. Enjoy. My great grandmother, I had your sort of stereotypical great grandmother she's probably 4'9". She had no filter, very, very sort of thick Jewish accent, would like cook the matzo ball soup for you in the middle of August when it was 103 degrees out. And she signed every single letter, sent every single goodbye with enjoy, enjoy. And by that, she just meant enjoy life, enjoy the people around you, enjoy what you do, enjoy who you are. And many, many people in my family, and she was by far the matriarch of our family. Everybody sort of has a personal story about something she said to them that was like jaw dropping, like, you can't say that. But now all of us sort of have adopted the enjoy as our signatures to our emails or letters or what have you.
I love it. All right. And a book you think everyone should read?
A book I think everyone should read, and other than my own, obviously. I actually think that everyone should read Marianne Wolfe's, I'm blanking, Read or Come Home. So many of us know Marianne Wolfe as a reading researcher. And she started this book. It used to, I think in its original format, it was an op-ed or a short piece of writing. And she writes about how she, as an adult, wanted to recreate the experience that she had as a child, where she was reading her favorite book. And I believe the book was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which was a really powerful book for me. And as an adult, she wanted to go back and read that book and recreate the feeling of being in the zone, meaning blocking out everything else, being so just deeply immersed in this book that hours pass and you're not even aware. And she said she couldn't do it. And she was so frustrated. She said her attention was everywhere. Her focus was minimal. And she was really frustrated about it. And so she dug into the science, and the book explores how living in a digital world has shortened our attention span. And she basically says, if you are struggling to focus, if you're struggling to read, you're not crazy. And for me, it was really validating because I was like, I totally feel this. The good news is she says that with, up to 2 weeks of really concerted, explicit focus on just turning on your notifications and disabling everything, that you can really get back to that point where you're just lost in a book. So it's kind of a look at the brain and the impact of technology in a digital world on reading. So I just think it's a lovely book that sort of intertwines personal narrative of her reading life along with brain science.
I haven't read it, but I will. I've read tons by her, but this sounds amazing and so important. I will tell you that someone once told me to put my phone charger in one place in my house and that would be a game. And it has totally changed my life, and that my phone kind of hangs out there and I can go other places and do other things. And I think that has made a really big difference in my ability to get back to reading. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for Marianne Wolfe for writing it. And thanks for being here today. This has been a really great time. Thanks for joining us on the More Than a Test podcast. If you found this conversation valuable, subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on your favorite podcast platform. At Amira Learning, we believe every child deserves a chance to become a reader, and we're excited to be part of this conversation. See you next week, and thanks for joining.